That's a point I'm going to underscore today throughout today's presentation. So despite starting what seems kind of like a Debbie Downer note, really that's just a way of wanting to acknowledge that we've been working really hard, really challenging circumstances, but we can together make the changes that we think will be helpful for us as well. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through a few things. And in designing today's presentation, I've kept in mind what I think would be most urgent to you, getting ready to start teaching next week, but also, as I understand, you're embarking on some conversations at Western that are part of longer term planning or revisioning around how the institution approaches or thinks about academic integrity and how to foster it. I'll begin just with explaining a little bit about the project I ran at UBC around academic integrity curriculum and approaches, focusing on outlining some of the key principles that we learned from that project and then put into practice, and then what that's meant, the kind of specific strategies and course approaches that we've put into place at the level of the department and in our courses. And I've left time at the end for questions. I'll check the chat. I've got a whole team here who are helping me manage the chat, but also check in as we go. I am going to pose a few questions to you in the course of the presentation. Those are not things I need you to or expect you to answer right now. They're really more reflections and takeaways as you go on to do the work of thinking about your approach to integrity. My hope for today is that what I'm sharing will confirm your perceptions, affirm many of your practices, provide additional ideas, and help create a forum for more conversation about creating a culture of integrity. The comics are very good to an academic integrity researcher, which I find interesting. That's a place where I get a lot of material about some public comedic takes on academic misconduct, primarily misconduct and cheating, which suggests that it's something that comics artists see as resonant in public discussions. But this comic in particular, I chose because I thought it really captured that dominant idea in higher education and public discussions about what misconduct is, and that is, a criminal kind of offense. This is the stance most of us will have encountered in our own education and training, that we've taken into our own teaching. It's the one we most often see in university policy documents and in instructor syllabuses or syllabi, depending where you land on that particular debate. This comic also really captures the attitude that I brought in to thinking about academic integrity through a misconduct lens. And that's an attitude that is captured as the quasi-judicial, punitive, moralizing approach. So I have come to academic integrity research in two ways. So I began as an instructor. I've been an educator for over 20 years, teaching academic writing and English literature courses. And in that role, I was super into this sort of attitude of busting cheaters and upholding rigor, and really quite proud of my record of smoking out misconduct cases. But then I became an administrator. I was the director of first-year programs for 7 years. And in that role, I needed to meet with students who had been reported by my colleagues for misconduct. And in that role, I had a real teachable moment around academic integrity, because I was having these meetings with students in which I had discussions with them about how they came to be in my office. And I came to realize that many students, most students, were there because they did not have really any idea what we expected them or how to meet those expectations. Perhaps most importantly, they had no idea why we cared so much. We were clearly not communicating any kind of meaningful rationale that would help them understand what these expectations were, and we weren't doing a good enough job of teaching them how to meet those expectations. So that started to undermine my buy-in to the dominant approach that assumes students will commit misconduct, that's just a given, and that when they do so with malicious intent. Now, certainly that's the case some of the time, but not always. I was realizing that many students who ended up in these meetings were there for so many other reasons, and we'll talk more about that later on. But the language and the kind of institutional approach that they face from us is scary and intimidating. It suggests that you should go to jail, and that meant that they don't feel like they could ask us for help. As an analogy, we're using a scared straight approach like we've seen in the war on drugs, and we know that that didn't work out very well either. So as I learned from these students in these meetings, I reflected on my teaching, began to read scholarship in academic integrity studies. I came to realize that this default approach was punishing, as Cheryl Kears pointed out, students for knowledge they don't have. It's a blaming and shaming approach, as Ho and Rogue has pointed out, that doesn't have or lacks room for a real understanding of why students might end up committing misconduct. And as critically as Tricia Bertram-Gallant argues, that framework is letting the institution off the hook by shifting the responsibility and blame entirely to the student. That's certainly the language of UBC's formal document, calendar policy documents it's up to the students. So having had this sort of epiphany, what can we do about that gap? I took on a small group of faculty in the units that I was running to launch a larger project to think about how we could do things to address that gap. Our project has a tongue-in-cheek name, our cheating hearts with a question mark to signal our interest in challenging the normative discourse about academic misconduct, who commits it and why. We were working in first-year writing courses for students across UBC. Now, interestingly, these were writing courses that already were doing many of the things that academic integrity scholarship suggests are the best practices for cultivating academic integrity. We were scaffolding, student-led projects, etc. We still had a significant gap. We had a lot of misconduct cases. But we had such transformative results very early on with just a pilot that we were able to roll out to all of our faculty, which means that by the time the project wrapped up, we have reached over 5,000 students a year. That curriculum is now embedded and continues today. Throughout the project, we generated resources, including a website with instructional materials. I wrote this book chapter. And at UBC, I've also been part of the group that's created a fabulous new resource for students, instructors. That's an academic integrity website. And I've linked to all of those things on the handout that Joe's put in the chat for you. Just wait for my slides to catch up. Oh, there we go. So as we learned and understood more about the harms that the blaming and shaming model does to our students, we thought, okay, how are we going to do things differently? What's the shift that we need to make? What if we began not by expecting our students were cheaters in waiting, but learners, as we do with so many of other things? And how could we teach what our expectations were differently? This meant that we were taking what's known in the literature as an educative approach. And Eaton and Adino put this so nicely. It's proactive rather than punitive, thinking about students as learners, as Tricia Bertram-Gallant puts it, and thinking about how we can be approaching this through an educative lens, giving them a better rationale than don't get caught, and thinking about why they should find academic integrity as meaningful to them as students, scholars. That's a way of cultivating what's known as a culture of integrity, where we have an institutional or department-wide or a course-wide commitment to working with integrity. And I really want to emphasize that upholding that commitment does not mean, or taking an educative approach does not mean no consequences. On the contrary, having clear consequences for misconduct and making sure that those cases are properly investigated and procedures followed is in fact key to creating that culture of integrity, because students know the expectations and know that we will uphold them. very happily, we've seen real and tangible transformations that suggest that we are creating that culture in our courses, and indeed are changing the conversation across the university, and as it's rippling out, joining a larger conversation in higher ed about a culture of integrity. We went from pre-pandemic, the number of cases significantly dropped that were reportable. And what was most gratifying is that we had a change in the type of case. We had weeded out the students who were there because they didn't understand the expectations. Those cases of accidental or unintentional misconduct that are so devastating for students and really for faculty as well. The students instead that I was meeting in these misconduct meetings, I would say were there for having committed academic dishonesty. They had bought papers or had colluded in other kinds of ways. Pardon me. These are things that we can also say very happily were small scale changes. That we got these results not by taking a sledgehammer to our courses, but doing what James Lang talks about as small teaching changes, tweaks to what we are already doing, and then reaping the results. Now, one thing I wanted to pause on is that as we've shared these results with our colleagues across campus, they've taken them up and adapted them across disciplines, across types of courses, small courses, large courses, graduate level, undergraduate. So while our project took place in writing courses, the strategies and principles are adaptable to your context. So think about them as some guidelines that you, and in some cases, some strategies or even some specific tools that you can then take up, plug and play, adjust to your own courses. In the second half of the presentation, I'll be sharing those specific results. In this project, we began by thinking about our students. So that opening question about shifting to a model in which we opened with trust. But for me, as both the principal investigator on this project and as the administrator, the director of first year programs, I was really thinking a lot about what I was asking my faculty and staff to do in making this change, and how was I going to get them on board, how to support them in doing this work in a sustainable way. So for one, that was about recognizing that such a change is both conceptually and pragmatically new and challenging work. And this is often when I meet my colleagues across universities, they say, well, how do I get my colleagues to change as well? So I thought I would begin by talking about how we worked at the level of the department, or if you have a small faculty, the ways that we can establish a culture of integrity at the collective level. For us, we recognize that when you build the culture of integrity beyond your own classroom, when you start at the collective level and collaborate, that's going to make the work easier. We also knew that it's so much easier to do this work when it is shared. It's not just one person sort of speaking into the void. In our experience, the same principles that worked for our students also worked for faculty and staff, which suggests that we all benefit from an educative framework in which we collaborate to make expectations explicit and meaningful. This is a way for us to become agents of change, what Tricia Bertram-Gallant calls the champions of integrity, and that we can be supporting each other in that work. Just this is sort of an overview slide. I'm going to talk about each of these things in turn to give an overview of the steps we took to bring on faculty on board and then continue to support them. We really thought, while we have all these plans and focus on student, we need to begin with our faculty for this transformation to take root and flourish, because faculty are the ones who are engaging students in the classroom. They're doing the hard work. And we wanted to make sure that the project was a done with rather than a done to. And that approach ended up working quite well in our units because all faculty felt like they could see themselves in the project and could see how they could participate in it. So let me walk through some of these key steps we took to bring faculty on board and support them. The first was the work of doing our own self-study. This was part of a commitment to taking an evidence-based approach. This was an absolute speaking back to that anecdotal-based hysteria or moral panic we often see, thinking back to the comic with the plagiarist in jail, because attitudes about misconduct are so often based on rumor and stereotype, and we needed to know instead what was an evidence-based approach. We're scholars, you know, what are we working with that's actually supported by data. And we also needed to know what were the problems that we needed to solve in our particular courses with our particular students. So we looked at what were our typical causes. We talked to faculty. I reviewed all of the disciplinary reports that we'd had. And we also needed to know what kind of process were we following. And that led to some real learning, unlearning, and relearning, as Toffler's language suggests, an ethos that required us to really check ourselves and make some changes. And I'm going to come back later to some of the specific aspects of unlearning that we had to do. The next two steps in building a culture of integrity are really about working across differences and providing support for this major work. One was thinking strategically and intentionally about scalability and workload and the needs of faculty. To take on the cognitive load of reimagining our approach, we thought, let's remove that barrier for faculty, particularly since we are in a unit that had a lot of contract faculty who are not paid for work beyond their particular courses. So how can we make that better for them? Let's produce some adaptable resources, the ones that I've shared in the website link that's in the handout, so that when you come to take on this work, you're not starting from scratch. Each one of us could draw on these resources. We also were thinking about, we have 4 different units, we have hundreds of sections. Are we going to mandate one way to do this? That's not going to work. That doesn't respect differences of courses, differences of instructor style. Instead, let's adopt a common framework, which happens to be, we're going to take on this educative and explicit approach to academic integrity rather than insisting on it being done in particular kinds of ways. And again, those things have resulted in full instructor buy-in. 2 final and key pieces were to establish expectations and how to meet them for faculty. You see, this sounds very similar to what we will do for our students. Academic integrity studies and our own anecdotal experience have made very clear that many faculty don't or didn't have a common understanding of what constitutes misconduct or how to address it, or they just don't address it for various reasons. Faculty and staff, like students, often have made mistakes or don't bother following through because they don't know what the policy is, or they don't know how to follow it, or they don't feel supported in doing so because it takes too much time, or they're not sure what will happen. Those are problems that undermine confidence in the system if the policies are not uniformly applied, so that what's okay in one class is not okay in another, or there are different interpretations of terms such as plagiarism. We give students a sense that it's arbitrary, it's a system, it's divorced from some kind of meaning. Non-compliance and inconsistency by faculty and staff do then have a cost in terms of both faculty and students, because it makes it seem like academic integrity is unfair, it's inequitable, reinforces exclusions, and it does harm. So we made sure that our instructors understood we were all going to be looking for this, and that we all understood what the expectations were. That involved making sure that we had a shared definition. For example, a big talk for us, it was around what are teachable moments and when do those stop? And reviewing policy procedures, making sure those were clear, clarifying where we could, understanding the larger institutional process. And Julia Christensen Hughes's point that students cheat when they feel cheated is a good reminder for us when they feel cheated by us. So that's part of our responsibility. this is an opportunity for you to think about kind of culture of integrity check in for you individually as an instructor, or for you collectively as a department or school. Do you all know? Do you all have these shared agreements and understandings about what academic misconduct is, how to proceed, and most importantly, who do you ask if you have questions or need help? This is such a frustrating situation when you have a misconduct or case or suspected one. That it's really important that they have somebody they can send, run things past, or just say, what do I do? Where's the check-in piece? This is particularly important when we have faculty who are, again, contract faculty or members of equity deserving groups who are precarious in various ways. They're already doing extra labor. They may be facing challenges to their authority. They are vulnerable, and they need to make sure that we are supporting them. So I'm just going to see, there's nothing happening in the chat. Okay, I will continue. I wanted to turn to thinking about the kind of key principles, the key lessons that we took away when we did this self-study, when we started on this project, and when we assessed the work that we were doing in our courses, because there were some unexpected aspects of learning that we hadn't anticipated. That when we adopted that educative framework, developed what I call pedagogies of integrity, we learned a lot from our students, and we learned a lot about the things that we were still carrying in as things we needed to unlearn. So I'll share now some of those key lessons that happened when we changed the conversation in our classrooms, and then I'll turn to the specific strategies we used in our courses. So as this comment captures, there's a misunderstanding around what plagiarism is. Just as I talked about, our faculty don't always know what plagiarism is, or misconduct more broadly, whatever cheating looks like in your discipline. Students really have no idea what we mean by it. They don't always know how to put it into practice, and they have no idea why we care. This is borne out by the research suggesting that students come to our courses, whether it's first year, senior courses, graduate level, with such varying backgrounds and depth of knowledge. And crucially, as a Peters and Kaju study has shown, the gap is that students think we're going to teach them these things, but faculty think students already know. That's a big discrepancy. That also reflects a common attitude that many faculty have, that academic integrity is something students learn somewhere else. Maybe that's in high school, maybe it's in a first year English or writing course, maybe there's a co-curricular model that Western has that students are required to take. And therefore, it's not something that each one of us needs to teach in our own courses, not just put in the syllabus, but actually teach. That assumption inaccurately suggests that learning about academic integrity is kind of a one and done. It's a one-off. You can do it somewhere else, which denies its complexity, its nuance, and its discipline-specific applications. By extension, that attitude reinforces for students that our academic integrity is really just about rules that are both kind of easy and inconsequential, unless you get caught violating them. But also, if they don't know, and we aren't teaching them, we're assuming they already know it, then that's the student's personal deficiency. They've missed something basic. If we sort of let that condition stand, one thing that's quite upsetting is that if we're not helping our students, someone else is going to step in to help them. That might be their peers. It also can be contract cheating sites. And we'll talk more about what that help looks like when we get to when a contract cheating site steps in here. So this was really a student-focused shift, one that needs to meet students where they are, embraces academic integrity as a foundational set of practices that we learn and apply with more and more sophistication over time and in specific situations. So that's key. Now, another learning, and you'll have heard about this morning, is thinking about academic integrity as that larger conversation about hidden curriculum. That was a big light bulb insight, one that really struck home with me. In fact, it was one of the most transformational understandings for me, was how much academic integrity or misconduct intersect with things that we are assuming our students know and understand. Many of the students I interviewed in academic misconduct cases were there because they lacked understanding not only of our expectations about integrity practices, but they didn't understand things about how the university works that we were all assuming everyone knows. That, for example, you could ask for an extension, or you could hand in an assignment late, but with a late penalty. And they felt they didn't have choices and made poor ones. I also met a lot of students who were in profound crisis, dealing with incredibly challenging situations, but either didn't know about resources that were available to them, or more poignantly, didn't feel that they could be accessing them. They didn't have that kind of sense of belonging that thought they matter in this community and there was help available for them. For our group, once we kind of realized that, we really engage in those larger conversations in our courses about what I call how to university, the larger skills that we expect and want to support our students in mastering, about note-taking, time management, using the library, providing resources to help them do resources that we want them to use as opposed to a contract cheating site, reminding them about resources and support throughout the semester, and really committing to listening to our students. So as you sort of reflect on that piece, thinking around what are the barriers that we need to learn about and how can we remove those for our students. So here I wanted to just open up for a brief a Quizlet, a little tiny quiz, a quick check-in to ask you, what are the groups that we most often hear about as being likely to cheat? Who is in the headlines? We have any suggestions? Nicholas is suggesting ESL students. Yeah. Hi, Alyssa. Alyssa and I are UBC alums. Nice to see you, Alyssa. Yes, people with procrastination issues, different practices across different countries. Sure. Any other thoughts? This is not Socratic. I don't have specific answers in mind. Even just working with those three, I think that we can, first years, yes. So students without a lot of experience, students with different kinds of experiences, different kinds of language proficiency. We often hear hysteria in the news, and often sometimes from our colleagues about international students, which is a coded term for all kinds of diversity, but particular kinds of diversity, often being English as additional language learners. But what does the research show? Studies for gender, race, religion, and other factors do not show that students have, that these factors do not produce higher rates of committing misconduct. I'm drawing here from a study by Parther in 2020, it's cited on the handout. But we do see exceptionally different rates of some students being reported. So international students, as Mary Davis and John Beasley have shown, are overrepresented in disciplinary actions. But misconduct rates between, and this is despite the fact that just misconduct rates between domestic and international students, as Tracy Brettag's 2019 study has shown, are actually quite similar. Sarah Eaton has shown that men are more often reported, but women are more likely to be forgiven without being reported. And that's especially true for white women who are native English speakers, what Eaton calls the angel effect. Some of the implications of this is that, as Mary Davis's research has shown, once international students are identified, they're more likely to drop out or be expelled. Or students, such as the first years that Joe's flagged, When students are new to the university and then get a misconduct referral, this makes the student feel like they were outsiders and they will disengage. So this has some real consequences for us. Tracy Brettag's work in 2019 also reminds us, as I'm quoting here, diversity means more than international students. So we could think about first generation students, students with disabilities, students who are carers or have other commitments outside of work. So once we knew that, once we sort of do that unlearning work around stereotypes about academic misconduct and think about it as an intersectional issue, that can allow us to do the work of rethinking and challenging implicit bias. I point to the massive scandal, I would say, around Proctorio and other algorithmic proctoring softwares as such a wake-up call for us. We saw with those programs that they were designed with implicit bias built in. What were they looking for? What was seen as normal? What was even seen? Thinking about how those cameras did or did not pick up certain kinds of students or flag some kinds of behaviors. So it can also be around thinking about those barriers, reflecting back to what I just spoke about. Maybe we needed to better support and welcome accommodations for students, or have some flexibility around deadlines as other ways to think about the intersectionality of how misconduct often is produced. The ideal here is that we're creating the conditions in which students are working with integrity. So that, again, I turn over to you just for thinking about that larger role about what the institution is doing to make academic integrity hard, and in some cases harder, for certain groups of students. And you'll know best in your own courses, in your own departments at Western, who those might be, or that might be something a self-study will produce, thinking about where are those places for intervention. For us in our program, the big takeaway that really shaped our approach was a realization that instead of focusing on the problem, we could think about an opportunity, the opportunity afforded by an educative approach, but also recognizing our responsibility, that we had the responsibility to teach this, to create the conditions that invite and enable all students to be able to do their work with integrity, and that we're doing our work with integrity as well in that culture. And that's something that we can, as instructors, staff, and students, we can meet this challenge if we're doing it together. Just having a quick scan. Okay, nothing happening in the chat. So I will turn now to focusing on how we put this into practice in our courses, just to give you a sort of snapshot of some of the things that we did as we designed and implemented explicit and enhanced instruction and discussion of academic integrity expectations and how to meet them. This is what we found worked for us in those first year writing courses, but then we've taken them up, many of us, in our other courses, and our colleagues are taking them up across the university. So memes are another source of great comedy gold for me as I think about ways to engage in this topic with my students. So here's Melania copying from Michelle Obama. We need to make our expectations explicit. We need to make the resources and support explicit, and we need to do that right at the start and then all throughout the course, thinking about making it live as part of the course as a whole. Wanting to be clear, consistent, and contextual, thinking about what academic integrity looks like in this course, this assignment, this program, in this year level, and that we are committing to doing that in every single course that we teach. That's a way of affirming a collective investment across the institution, again, undermining that sense that these expectations are arbitrary or instructor specific, and as a way of renewing those commitments. Jenny Wilkinson has done a study in Australia of second and third year students And the discovery that for those students, their sense of urgency about misconduct diminishes over time. They come, we can think about this, we often are hitting students over the head with the messaging around integrity in orientation as they come in first year. And then if we never talk about it again, they're going to have that diminishment in the sense of this is something that they need to worry about. So continually renewing and developing our understanding of academic integrity. One way that we chose to do this, that was a quick fix. We saw the syllabus statement as a low-hanging fruit. Many of us had a statement about plagiarism or a statement about cheating or misconduct. And we thought, what if we rewrote that? That seems like a place to make a significant public statement that could change the conversation. So we rewrote that statement to be a statement on integrity that used a student-centered and aspirational approach. So changing the language to talk about integrity rather than the thing we want to avoid, the violations of integrity expectations, and then making that language really speak to students in a clear and accessible and supportive way, providing a rationale. This is what it is. This is why we care about it. This is why it matters to you in this course and you as a scholar and student scholar at the institution, providing real specifics about what violations look like with particular emphasis on the kinds of things that you in your course know might be difficult, particular problems. And then providing specific and accurate information about what the university policy is and consequences so that students know. And lots of links to or the names of places that they can go to get help when they need to put this expectation into practice. We put that in our syllabus. It takes up a lot of space, so it has a kind of weight there. And then we talk about it in our courses. This is a big shift for us. Many of us were used to just popping it in the syllabus and never talking about it ever again. And so we took that up instead in our courses, often as part of an early on exercise in which we asked our students to collaborate to define academic integrity as a way to kind of create a group agreement and to have them check their understanding. We also made sure that academic integrity was part of the course learning outcomes, not a nice to have, not an extra thing, but core content for us, and embedded always in the evaluation of every single assignment, not a formatting thing, not an extra, but a core part of the learning. This helps make it matter. I do this in all the courses I teach of all levels. Just again, renewing that investment, reminding students of these expectations. This is part of, this can launch a kind of conversation to continue with your students where we can break that connection between these guidelines as rules or classroom, schoolroom requirements, and instead dig deep into the why piece. Why does this matter? How does it underpin what we do as scholars and the knowledge we do at the university and how that changes and shapes the world? That's why it matters to us that we do our work with integrity. This is a great place to have a conversation or an exercise with students where they think about the harms. What happens if we don't do our work with integrity? That might have consequences for the value of your degree. That might be a meaningful inspiration for some students, but also think about what happens when scholars present knowledge that is flawed. What could happen there? And that's where the discipline-specific applications would be really interesting. What happens when a nurse fakes information on a chart, or an engineer falsifies calculations in bridge design, just as two examples. Presenting students with scenarios anonymized from your course or anonymized from your discipline or profession can be terrific ways to get that conversation started. Also to get at some of the gray areas. Is this misconduct? If so, it's why. How could this have been run off? Ideally, if we can tie that to professional practices, like for me in my literature courses, thinking about academic journal submission guidelines, tri-council, research ethics boards. Those are ways for reminding them that this is an enterprise we're all engaging in. Of course, students are in classrooms and we do need to give them grades. So that's where we can have some reflection and shift or change our assessments to foster academic integrity in the work that they're doing in the course. We have to recognize that we're not going to be able to, as Sarah Eaton puts it, design misconduct out. I'm not Pollyanna here. I know that we're not going to eradicate all cheating, but we can certainly create the conditions where more students will see that it's possible for them and they'll know how to do that. We can, as Sarah Eaton puts it, design integrity into our assessments by shifting to or emphasizing authentic learning opportunities that allow students to demonstrate their learning, how they know versus what they know. Now, of course, as you take out these questions, you have to reflect on what's going to work in your courses for your instructors. If you have contract faculty, if you have a very large courses or multi-section courses, this work can be done in these situations, but you'll need to be thinking about those factors for you. So some particular strategies that we used and that our colleagues have used across the university, or that we've seen discussed in literature, are things around scaffolding. In writing courses or project-based courses, building in the steps, ideally with a peer review component where you can get students to be supporting each other in making sure they're meeting those expectations. That takes the onus off of the instructor to be the only person who can be guiding students. Thinking about things like individualized or making assessment design tailored to your particular course in different ways. And we can talk during the chat about what this has looked like for faculty members, for example, who design multiple choice questions. Thinking about asking, how do we assess our student learning? How do we ask students to demonstrate their learning in ways that are specific to this course versus that are more general with things that are likely to be already online that they can use? The gold standard is the very challenging way, is also a very challenging way. So Sarah Eaton has shown that getting students to perform things, do a hands-on exam or an oral exam, those are very difficult to contract cheat or to cheat on. Of course, they're also very difficult to scale. Certainly my colleagues in chemistry, for example, have found a way to do a group oral quiz. That's just one strategy. So that can be the ideal. We might not be able to all get there, but I share it as an example. Now, many of these approaches better support student learning by breaking down projects into smaller parts, such as scaffolding, peer review, inviting student input in choice, which gets them to sort of develop their own interests. And things like the exam wrappers or self-reflections also foster metacognition. And again, these are nice bonuses at the same time. As part of our changed assessment design, ideally we'll build in ongoing support and conversations and invite our TAs to do this as well. If you have TAs who are in teaching, live teaching capacities, and your TAs may have these same questions actually, since they are students too. So this is a way of supporting just-in-time learning, making it relevant as they go, because what might have seemed easy and doable when you talked about it in the first few weeks of term may seem a lot harder in the dark days of midterms or end of term, or they come up against that point where they thought they really did understand, and now when you're asking them to do it, they don't know how. In-class time for consultation. This was a wonderful change that our faculty reported, that once they normalized asking questions, students ask questions all the time. They came to office hours. They really seemed to have broken that cycle where not knowing was shameful, and that opened up class. But we also can turn to them as partners. Okay, we've got this new assignment. How are you? What could you think about about how we can meet our expectations of doing our work with integrity in this assignment, this application. That's particularly important when it doesn't look like something they've done before. So maybe they're doing a poster or an oral project or a group project, which is really challenging. My own students found a real hiccup when they went to do their blogs for the first time. They just sort of cast off any expectations that they would cite or link or give image credits, which allowed us to have a recalibration after that. And I've framed how I teach that differently. Really thinking again, what's hidden curriculum? When I use the term research, do my students know what I mean? When we talk about expectations around originality, but also ask them to enter the scholarly conversation and cite, how do we square those two things? This leads to, again, that urgency around busting hidden curriculum, making sure that we are giving students explicit guidelines, or at least having an open and frank conversation with them. We don't always have to know all the answers, but we need to be ready to listen. So upfront expectations around what help is acceptable in your course. So if you are a language instructor, for example, using, my colleagues have pointed out, this is something I've learned from my colleagues in those courses, that using a translation software is not a form of acceptable help because it is antithetical to the learning that my colleagues are needing to assess. But also, what's the difference between getting feedback, like in a peer review, versus editing? Is editing okay in your discipline? It may or may not be, or you may have some expectations around that you need to make clear. To use Thomas Lancaster's term, and I've lost my quotation marks on citation on this, so apologies. Thomas Lancaster talks about toxic tutors, who are normally representatives of contract cheating sites, versus ethical tutors. Where are the ethical tutors in your university ecology? Can you point them to them? Thinking about spending some time talking in class about contract cheating. And again, you don't have to know all the answers, but open a forum. There's lots of resources that are available, some on the academic integrity website UBC's just built, that provides some information for you, but I'll also tell you some more things that might be helpful for you to have that conversation. So drawing here on Sarah Eden's work in the Canadian context, we all know contract cheating is prevalent. It's grown exponentially through the pandemic, and it's a massive global industry that is preying on students at their most vulnerable. Students who take up the many invitations or responses from contract cheating companies often end up in extortion situations and then are further victimized. So they end up threatened by the company to keep paying, for example, or they will reveal to the institution that they've used a contract cheating site. And they're quite nefarious in that these companies have fronts that look legitimate, homework help sites, partnering with institutions like, very sadly, the online writing lab at Purdue, which is now a partner with Chegg. So students are not entirely sure where the help ends and the exploitation begins. So have a forum, a conversation, not only let students know, not necessarily, again, in that scared straight way, but lets them know that they are going to potentially be faced with consequences that are personal as well as professional, but also show that you know about these things, you care about them, and you are committed to making sure that work that is done with integrity is rewarded. That can also be a conversation in which you reiterate what are the legitimate sources or help that they can draw on, and how can they handle situations, for example, with a peer? There's lots of research about peer-to-peer attitudes as being hugely influential. Whether you're doing all your work as an instructor to establish a culture of integrity, if the peers are trying to undermine that, what are some ways that you could talk about for how to bring more students on board? So a student might say, I'm not going to share my lab report with you, but I'll give you some feedback on yours. That could be a strategy to have in the pocket. So thinking just as a way of sort of summarizing these lessons, these are the kind of the 5 core elements that we've talked about in terms of our culture of integrity, elements that can be scalable, building a culture, whether it's in your own course, or maybe it's with a few colleagues who teach a multi-section course, ideally at the level of your department, or that you're speaking up as champions of integrity at the level of the faculty, at the level of your institution. We're thinking about how Western can have a culture of integrity. For us, we did that across first-year programs, and it made a real difference in terms of how we felt about our students, how our students were engaging with us, and as I've shown, in the kinds of ways students were taking up the invitation to do their work with integrity. So as I've noted, students need to feel comfortable to ask questions. Faculty and staff need to be able to feel comfortable asking those questions now. So I hope I can turn things over to you for your questions and comments by adding the chat. Oh, actually, I've been told we're not going to raise hands because there's people who are live and people in doing this virtually. But I'm going to stop sharing now so I can see your lovely faces. And thank you so much for listening to my my strategies. Okay, Joe's drumming up questions in the chat.
And Laurie, can you hear us in the room?
I can hear you.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so I'm also going to be looking with my eyes around to see if anyone in person has a question. And then Laurie, you'll be able to hear the question because I'll actually run over to the person. They can talk on the microphone, and then I might even repeat it after.
Okay,
thanks.
So
I'm looking with my eyes. Does anyone have a question in this room? Yes. Okay, so Laurie, I'm going to someone who's going to ask a question, okay?
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Aurea, for sharing your research on academic integrity. So actually in my department, the topic of academic misconduct and academic integrity is a hot topic in any meeting. And what you share right now, I understand what we need to do in our classroom. But now I assume that I am in the shoe of a student. Mm-hmm. And now I feel like in an online teaching environment and learning environment, since the pandemic, everything moved online, including the exam. And then I feel like in some way, the changing in the environment create the chance for academic misconduct. That's the first thing. And the second thing is the increase of numbers of essay meals in Canada. So we saw University of Toronto and professor try to sue company. They steal material, so many things, and sell to students. But actually, they have a very good strategy to access students. So with so many temptation around students, they send to email from students with promotion, but with very common name like easy education or tutor. And students, they just don't know this is good or bad. So what can we do to help students in this case?
Yeah, I mean these contract cheating companies are really savvy about the forms of outreach. So multilingual, direct appeals. Colleagues have reported in institutions that have gone back to in-person cheating, or sorry, in-person teaching, that agents of those companies will come and hand out flyers in a classroom, so it looks kind of legit. You know, they're there as representatives of, or with the agreement of the university. I think that's why it's so important that we intervene by providing that information, to acknowledge up front, hey, you know, you might be approached by a company that looks like this, or has these, you know, that uses these kinds of terms, free tutoring, homework help sites, and get them to to understand that they actually have to be aware that not everything is benign, not everything is, or if they are on the fence, this is where I think if we make that culture of integrity in which they understand they have choices to make, and there are some options that don't involve popping onto Reddit and saying, can anyone write my lab report for me? That they might be more inclined to remember, you know what, I do have other options, or this will be investigated, pursued, taken seriously if I make other choices. But that is the real challenge. There's a national committee. I'm on this committee. It's being led by Sarah Eaton. That's studying contract cheating in Canada, and with the purpose of making recommendations for education, but also for government to think about how can we push back. Europe and Australia are way ahead of us in that they have done things like Europe has passed legislation banning contract cheating companies, and Australia is on a similar path. So again, thinking about what a statement that makes when a government says, we see that these companies are illegal and we will take action against them. But it is the challenge. Where we have agency as instructors is to really think about helping students understand what's involved, what the options they have, and that you take that seriously as well. And thank you so much for the question.
So Laurie, I'll read the question from the chat for everyone here in the room.
Okay.
We often hear about colleagues who are resistant to believe the data and continue to rely on anecdotal information. Any strategies to help naysayers? This is the theme all day, like the people who are here are the ones who are going to actually do the thing. So what about everyone else who's not here? So any strategies to help naysayers or active resistors? For example, we have a number of teaching assistants or graduate assistants here today who don't have the same power to make these decisions.
Yes. Yeah, that's when you've got a negative Nelly in the group, it's a challenge. So with the caveat that of course we can't always change all hearts and minds. Some things we found that worked. And so I think there's two parts to this question. One is sort of thinking about our colleagues who might have entrenched attitudes and practices, and then thinking about strategies for people who are not necessarily in a position to make sort of the kinds of broader changes. So first part, one of the things I did find most persuasive, and there were some long-standing colleagues in first year programs who kind of thought I was being naive when I launched this project. What was most persuasive was when we could show the data from our courses, not sort of the university coming up with this data or that I'd drawn from the literature. Like, we study what was happening in our courses. I also made sure that we were really pitching the appeal around why we should address this to what was in it for them, by making some very small changes. So they didn't have to buy into something a larger mindset that they didn't necessarily believe in, but they could change one or two things. They could adopt the new syllabus statement, for example. That doing something in this new way was going ultimately to make life better for them, because a misconduct case takes so much time, energy, emotional labor. That was a carrot for them, that making some very small changes that really did at heart align with their sense of themselves as scholars. That was an incentive. I'm in a different department now where I'm going to embark on the same conversations, and I may meet more resistance. This is the approach I'm going to take: evidence-based, the carrot of results that will be time-saving for them, and providing them with resources that they can already use. I'm not asking you to do all of this work on your own. Here are some things that you could try. And also, just again, changing the conversation in the faculty meeting, the department meeting, is no longer about how we should expel all people who are plagiarists, but how can we support students in not becoming plagiarists? You know, there is a kind of collective vibe that can happen that brings people along. Again, not everybody, but the more people who respond to that aspirational, productive, and positive approach, and many do, that kind of at least silences some of that resistance. If you're a TA or a GA where you are working with students and wanting to make those changes, I think the things that you probably will be able to control, again, depending on the kind of responsibilities you have. What is the language that you are using with students? Are you talking about integrity versus misconduct? Are you able to provide some discussion in your own courses around the kinds of hidden curriculum aspects that we've talked about today? Are you making sure that you are asking the instructor of record about how you will handle cases of misconduct? Now, again, you may get pushed back and they say we don't bother doing those things, but at least you were asking. I think you could, without knowing enough about each situation, I'm not sure how much opportunity you would have to kind of continue that conversation or to push for changes. But again, saying, I anticipate this will be an issue. How will you help me and how can I help my students would be a great conversation to have as a teaching team or with the instructor of record. So many of the things I've talked about, again, are shifts in practice, language, and approach that really can be done whether or not you have the kinds of overall perspective or opportunity or leadership that I was able to exploit as both the lead of this project and the boss as the director of the programs. I hope that's helpful. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Laurie. So we've got a question, but it's like really far away. Okay, Laurie. So just hold on while I run up the stairs.
I hope you wore your pumps, not your pumps, your sneakers.
I wore my running shoes today.
Hi, Dr. McNeill. Thank you again for your insightful presentation today. This might sound like a really basic question, but I can't help but think about the quote you had on one of your slides there about when that said students cheat when they feel cheated. Again, this sounds like a basic question, but what are those instances when students feel cheated? And are there any instances that come up more often in cases where academic integrity is questioned or cases of misconduct?
Great. Oh, and thank you so much for coming back to that piece. So students feel cheated in the situations in which they don't think their instructor cares, not just about misconduct, but about the course. So in the literature, so here I'm not casting shade on particular practices of people I know. So in the literature, things like, thanks, Anne. Students report things like when the instructor only uses test banks, things that are widely available, when they don't update or change their assignments year after year. And so their assignments, exams, etc., are available. When they see that some students are being policed or rewarded in different ways. So those are just three areas of three kinds of examples of where students feel cheated by the experience that they are having in the class, and that or class, department, program, institution, where they feel like they are there to learn, and they aren't meeting that kind of a similar sense of responsibility. Does that answer your question?
Does that answer your question? Yes, it does. We got a thumbs up. Thank you, Laurie. I'm looking around in our last 5 minutes to see if we have maybe one or two more questions. Okay, here comes the question.
This person's coming to you. That's very generous.
Actually, this is a very technical question. I just want to learn from you because you conduct research on this. I'm just curious about this is my idea, and I don't know if this apply anywhere. But like to protect students from cheating, like from other SME and companies that sell like exams, something like that. Like we even think about like including a list of companies that can provide the service that is illegal. And some colleges suggest that we shouldn't do that because you might show it to some students that don't know those companies. And people also said that if we include those companies, they might change the names anytime. So do you see like any university, how people deal with this with a company, and any university that include a list like that? For example, in the course syllabus, for example, in my course syllabus, can I say you are not allowed to use the service from this company?
Okay, yeah, one of the conversations we had at UBC when we were making the academic integrity website was UBC legal going to let us name names? We decided ultimately that we were going to name names. We did it in the EG way. We picked the big two, like Chegg and Course Hero. So I think there is an advantage to, or value to, naming some sites to just sort of illustrate those kinds of the types of companies they might meet. But I think it's both impossible to capture all of them, and potentially an issue that you've raised here about, are we just identifying resources for them that we don't want them to check out? I would never link to those sites, for example, but I will name them. For example, I say in my syllabus statement, if you post things to Course Hero, that is actually a violation of my copyright and therefore a form of misconduct, just as an example. So I think probably a more manageable approach is, again, just focusing on the types of things, types of services that SA mills and contract cheating companies offer, and saying these are the things that you need to be aware of. A company that's offering these things to you is very likely not legitimate, and this is the kind of thing you are setting yourself up for if you enter into a relationship with that company. Thanks for that question. I see we got 3 more in the chat.
Yes, 3 more in 2 minutes. Haha.
Okay. I'll say one thing about multiple choice questions. This comes from a colleague at Douglas College in New Westminster, BC. I did a presentation there about academic integrity strategies, and he said that one of the things he did in the context of online learning was he made his questions, he designed his questions to include a celebrity name. So a student who then Googled that question would then end up being bombarded with results about like Jennifer Lopez, for example, rather than being able to very quickly find a result that was relevant to the problem they were trying to solve. So that was a fun strategy. I thought that was actually very effective. That's one example. I would recommend with the multiple choice designers, if you can team up with a group so that you are, maybe there's 10 of you and you each contribute 2 questions, knowing that your question set will be burned, you can't reuse it. That way you've only done 2. That's a place for sharing the load. So I'll put a pin in that for now and see if I can get to Alyssa's question about supporting academic integrity and group work. I hand this one over to the students. I asked them to come up with a group agreement, and this is part of the hidden curriculum busting. Students need to be taught how to work in groups. One of the things they need to do is have conversations about how they're going to work. I always make sure that they include how we're going to work with integrity as part of that. And I always include, as any kind of a group collaborative assignment, a reflection assignment in which they outline the various contributions each group member made. That's a place where they can be outlining, thinking about how this work was shared. That's just 2 examples. I'll leave that there for now because I want to make sure I get to Fiona's question. Where we find out about cultural differences in citing practice. So I think there's actually, I would go to the literature on on citation. Actually, there's some really interesting things about citation, not only in terms of different sort of cultural practices, but also things changing practices around, for example, trans scholars and what are the ethical ways to cite that. What does the citation look like in those contexts? So that can be, there's a whole body of literature that I'll just sort of point to in a general way, since I see that we're just past the time limit, and you might cut off my microphone.
Oh, I was just loving that. Okay, so, and Joe, who is e-learning and curriculum specialist, says, I like to get students to craft multiple choice questions too, each week as a post-assessment. Plus, it creates buy-in because if their questions are good, they'll see it on the exam and hopefully actually know the answer. So that's great. So I just wanted to let everybody know that if you came to my session just now about reframing failure, I talked about one of our online modules about promoting a positive perspective. However, there are more than just my module. There are modules actually about teaching group work and teaching about metacognition. And they're also about reaching students who you're having trouble reaching, like intercultural teaching practices as well. So I wanted to let you know that there's more there for you. So Dr. McNeill, I wanted to thank you so much. Even though you can't see me, I have the biggest smile on my face because we finally got to the bottom of some of the things that we've just been like, good question, now what? And so I really wanted to thank you for your presentation and for your thoughtful answers to our questions. So let's give Dr. McNeill a round of applause. Thank you. And with that, I'll say goodbye. Bye.
Thank you so much. Enjoy talking with you, and good luck for the semester.
Oh yeah, good luck. Thank you.